Watch this year's White House Easter egg roll Monday morning on C-SPAN.
The Council on American-Islamic Relations hosted this conference about Islamophobia at Metropolitan State University in St. Paul, Minnesota. A panel of historians, authors, and community activists discussed the history and intersection of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and white supremacy. This runs an hour 20 minutes.
Welcome to this first panel, this first breakout section on the intersections of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and white nationalism, white supremacy. My name is Erica Lee. I'm a professor of history and Asian American studies at the University of Minnesota. I also direct, when I'm not on leave, the Immigration History Research Center. And I just want to say this conference is phenomenal. It doesn't exist in many other places in that it brings together amazing scholars and experts nationally and internationally, pioneers in the ways in which we understand both the consequences, the roots of Islamophobia, but also in a really accessible and community-engaged environment. So I just want to express my gratitude to CAIR Minnesota and to the organizers for putting on the third iteration of this conference. So today we're going to spend some more time thinking about the intersections of hate, really, and I think we got a good beginning of some of that conversation in the first plenary section. And one of the takeaways that I got from that earlier session is the obvious point that Islamophobia does not exist in a vacuum. So I'm a historian. It's all of the historical notes that we've been here before. This is another iteration, or this is an evolution of earlier forms of state-sanctioned as well as private acts of hate and violence, obviously really resonated with me. And I just want to elaborate on that a little bit more. I think it was Professor Todd Green who said, this is racism. This is a form of racism. There's many different definitions of Islamophobia, and I think part of the conversation is it irrational? Yes, but it's expressed rationally, and it's made, it's legitimated, it's justified, it's normalized in very rational and sanctioned ways. And I think the more that we think about Islamophobia as a system of hate, as an ideology, and as a form of discrimination, I think that it moves us a little bit further in how we can better understand its intersections and its impact. Another key point here is white supremacy and white nationalism. Undergirding all of these systems of oppression in the United States and much of the world has been a system of white supremacy. It's important to remember that the first others in the United States were Native Americans and African Americans, and the ways in which we interacted with every other group that came after them was always in relation to where they fit on this hierarchy of our ways of knowing of whether they were savages or violent, assimilable, fit to be citizens, fit to become Americans. And so I'd like us to, as we engage in this discussion about intersections today, I'd like us to think about that historical foundation as well. So some of our panelists you've already been introduced to before, but they were much too humble. And since I have their full biographies, I'm going to take the liberty of telling you just a little bit more about them. So on your far right, Professor Todd Green, Associate Professor of Religion at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, a former advisor on Islamophobia at the U.S. State Department in Washington, D.C., an author of 2 books. I think we have at least one of them out there for sale up above. 2 books on Islamophobia, The Fear of Islam, An Introduction to Islamophobia in the West, and Presumed Guilty, Why We Shouldn't Ask Muslims to Condemn Terrorism. Next to him is Dr. Hatem Bazian, who you mentioned. If you didn't Google during the break his article, then we'll hear more about it. and get the exact citation. He's founded at Berkeley the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at the Center for Race and Gender at UC Berkeley. This is my go-to site. When I teach about Islamophobia in my classes at the University of Minnesota, I go directly to this site for not only its amazing research reports that have been produced, but also a really accessible and theoretically grounded definition of what Islamophobia is and its frameworks. He has also launched the Islamophobia Studies Journal, another go-to resource of mine in the study of Islamophobia. It is the only peer-reviewed academic journal on the subject. And he is founder and professor of Islamic law and theology at Zaytuna College, the first accredited Muslim liberal arts college in the United States. Next to Professor Bazian is Lauren Muscoplat, what I just learned, an alum of the University of Minnesota, has worked at the Jewish Community Action as a community organizer around immigration and worker justice issues. JCA is located in St. Paul. And she currently serves as lead trainer for the Tzedek Institute and other educational initiatives linking social justice issues and action. And then closest to me is Professor Khaled Beydou, a law professor at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville School of Law, and affiliated faculty at UC Berkeley. As you heard from him, he focuses on constitutional law, but he is best known right now for two projects. One is his amazing book, American-Islamic Understanding the Roots and Rise of Fear. And then, in my opinion, he's been one of the most important sources of information, insight, and compassion in the wake of the terrorist attacks in New Zealand. And if you go to Twitter and look under the hashtag 50Lives, you'll see the amazing work that Dr. Beydou has done in showcasing and redirecting our attention, the world's attention, to the victims and not the terrorist. So this is an amazing panel. We're so fortunate to have these scholars and experts and activists with us. And what my plan is to open up the discussion for about 10 to 15 minutes of, or as long as you want, of commentaries on these intersections. And then my goal is to leave more time for questions and answers at the end of these formal comments, so that we can start having a conversation with many of you who I think have lots of things to say. So do I have a volunteer for who would like to go first in our panel of distinguished speakers?
Yeah, 3 men and 1 woman. So.
Awesome. Lauren, please start.
All right, everyone can hear me? Okay, good morning. It's really good to be in this room with everyone who's interested in learning about this and figuring out what we do about it. A lot of people have been doing this as lifelong work, and I am newer to the spectrum of this, but I will just share some perspectives from Jewish Community Action and my own personal information. So when we have been working on different social justice issues in the Twin Cities community over time. For about 20 years, we've been around as an organization, and we've kind of always looked at things from this frame of white privilege and looking at the frames of how that impacts people and what is the role for white people to step into and do things. And we've, since the last election, since the last presidential election, kind of been shifting and realizing, like Dr. Lee mentioned, that this is much more systemic than we maybe realized before, and we've kind of changed our approach to looking at both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia stemming from a reality of colonial inheritance, colonial continuation, and seeing how the combination of white nationalism and Christian hegemony have kind of positioned this hateful rhetoric, this kind of systemic way of looking at different groups of people and making them others and dividing them from people who share interests. And so we're really interested in looking at these ways that white nationalism is trying to divide us and separate us, and rejecting that and understanding that that's an intentional behavior in order to stop people who naturally should be in alliance with each other from coming together and resolving some of these huge local, nationwide, and worldwide issues.
Assalamu alaikum. First, let me thank CAIR for organizing this conference second time and bringing us in here for such an important discussion. Thanks, Lee, for welcoming me here. Dr. Lee, Professor Lee is a graduate from UC Berkeley, so it's really a privilege. And her professor that supervised her thesis, Evelyn, is the person in the Center for Race and Gender that said, we need to do work on Islamophobia. So she opened the door for us to create a project and a program in the Center for Race and Gender. Evelyn is from Japanese background, so it's also to think of the connection, thinking of the Japanese community having went through the internment and recognizing immediately the need to address the problem of Islamophobia. So these are connections that takes place in a real sense of people's experiences being extended to the contemporary period. I teach a full course on Islamophobia, deconstructing Islamophobia and otherness in Asian American studies at UC Berkeley. And the question is, when do we start the discussion about Islamophobia? It's not about 9/11. It's not about the turn of the 20th century. We actually begin with the Inquisition, right? Because the construction of what we think of being white and Christian, or with the construction of the concept of Europe at a time was achieved by trying to otherize two large groups that were present in Europe, the Muslim and Jewish community. So you could not construct the European worldview at the time without actually coming into otherization and the expulsion of Muslims and Jews and putting in place a whole systematic inquisition that targeted religious identity. So when we think of Islamophobia and racism, it's how to actually govern and control the bodies and space of Muslims and Jews, initially in Europe. And there was a whole structure for the Inquisition. Muslims and Jews could not dress in their normal religious garb. They could not actually engage in any type of practice that will be religiously inclined relative to ritual bathing or cleansing. The kosher and halal was also restricted. That's why much of the southern Spanish cuisine was laced with pork as a way to demonstrate publicly that you're no longer upholding the requirements for food for consumption. Synagogues and mosques were converted to churches, and then those who were forcefully converted to Christianity, or we call the Moriscos, were finally expelled in 1609. So the Inquisition lasted almost 400 years, including in this also the about 100,000 women that were also put into the Inquisition because they were charged of being sorcerers and so on, and they did not uphold the orthodoxy, religious orthodoxy. So Islamophobia emerges from that moment, and then we get into the New World. The first exclusionary act in the New World was directed at Muslims from Western Africa. In 1526, the first exclusionary measure directed at Muslims from West Africa, as well as slaves who lived with the Ottomans or Muslims of the East. So that's where you begin the discussion about where these ideas that every once in a while they get to percolate, and a continuation of trying to create what we call purity of race. So we speak about the theology, or how the theology gets rolled into the discussion. And we had a whole debate in the New World about whether Native Americans have a soul or didn't have a soul, and end up with the genocide of Native population. Then you take it to the arrival of the African-American slaves, who arrived not as a human being, but arrived as cargo, and we still have to deal with what that means, still till today. The debate about Black Lives Matter, and everybody, when you say Black Lives Matter, everybody jumps at every life matter. Yes, everybody's life matter, but a whole bunch of lives were brought as a cargo, and they still don't matter even today. So when you say all lives matter, essentially you constructed the erasure that African Americans continue to suffer in the contemporary period. And then you have to go to the Chinese Exclusionary Act period. Then you have to go into how the Irish were not white, and post the Civil War, they were brought to be white as a way of contesting African American empowerment as the height of lynching. Then you go to the Jewish population and the exclusion of the Jewish population and the birth of Jewish organization to try to challenge anti-Semitism, passing through the labor movement, the women movement, the Japanese internment, civil rights movement, and then we speak of Islamophobia as the normative pattern of otherization, rather than try to exceptionalize Muslims by trying to discuss Islam, and all of a sudden we're talking about Islam and chapter 5 or 7 or 14 or whatever about the Quran and so on, and you completely lose the sense that America's norm is otherization. It's the exception is actually to work toward exclusion, and those are the moments. So once you put Islamophobia in the normative historical trajectory, then it'll be easy to understand what is taking place, rather than we begin the conversation, what does chapter 5 of the Quran says? And again, you lose completely the full lens of the American history as well as European history. I say that Europe has a problem with living with the other, because so far they have not demonstrated the capacity to live with the other, and the Holocaust exhibit 1, 2, and 3 to demonstrate that reality. And I think that's what we need to begin the conversation.
Yeah, good morning again. I'll preface my comments by what I wasn't intending to do is a shameless book plug now, but the topic actually makes sense. The book I wrote that came out last year called Presumed Guilty, Why We Shouldn't Ask Muslims to Condemn Terrorism, where that book really ends up in the last part, and in my opinion the most important part, is that Islamophobia in many ways is a distraction, and the way we talk about Muslims and violence and terrorism really is a distraction. In the United States and Europe towards white violence, white Christian violence, white American violence. I don't lose any sleep that we spend too much time talking about Muslims and violence in America. What we cannot talk about, what we struggle to talk about, what we struggle to enact policies against is white nationalist, white supremacist violence, right-wing terrorism, and commemorating and remembering a long history of violence that targets racial and religious minority communities. We know how to remember 9/11, and we know what the motto of that is, never forget. It's just not a motto I encounter when it comes to the genocide of the indigenous populations. Where is the 9/11 Memorial Museum for that, right? So what violence we remember, what violence we forget, the Islamophobia that drives that is actually intersected with anxiety about white identity, white nationalism, and white supremacy. So that's my preface. A few things briefly, just to get it going. First, I'm glad that we have this panel on this particular topic, the intersections of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, white supremacy, white nationalism. It's important that we talk more about this. We are starting to see some more public conversations after New Zealand, and that's good so far as it goes, so long as we can sustain it, and that's what I worry about. But at the very least, you see a perpetrator whose manifesto is peppered with comments, and it starts with the birth rates, right? This guy starts with anxiety about birth rates in Europe, and it goes into white genocide and fear of white genocide, fear of the loss of white identity in Europe and in the West, a replacement. Here are the Muslims and immigrants coming to replace us, right? For those of us who study Islamophobia, that's not a big surprise that his Islamophobia was intertwined with that kind of ideology. He's not particularly unique. Whatever that manifesto is, it's not unique, it's not original. It's the same kinds of anxieties that we've been hearing for a long time, and that have been uttered by other prominent political figures in other ways, including Donald Trump, but not just him. Marine Le Pen in France, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Viktor Orban in Hungary. They all hold very similar views. This guy's views were not outlying views. What he did in terms of acting upon them is different, but the views themselves, the worldviews, are very similar. So seeing that intersection at work is important. The other thing about that attack that I think can help us contextualize this particular topic is that It is the latest in a string of attacks for some time now in which angry white men and so-called Western nations have targeted racial and religious minority communities, often in houses of worship, out of fear of some loss of white identity or the threat to white Americanism or white Europeanism or whatnot. Think Oak Creek, Wisconsin, Charleston, South Carolina, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Quebec City in Canada, and now Christchurch. What do they share in common? Angry white men targeting racial religious minorities deemed as some kind of threat to them, to what it means to be Canadian or American or European or even white, right? So there's certainly some differences in those attacks as well, but there is some commonality that we should pay attention to as well in making sense of all of this. When it comes to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, I don't think this is talked about nearly enough. And yes, there are some very different histories at work here, and we need to pay attention to that. But there is some intersection in both Europe and the United States, for example. I believe anti-Semitism on both sides of the continent, of the Atlantic have actually gone to the same wellspring of white supremacy historically. What does it mean to be American? Jews, for a lot of history, were defined as not white. There's a lot of scholarship on how Jews became white, right? But that's telling you something about how Jews were categorized, racialized themselves, and that American identity and Jewish identity weren't seen as synonymous in the same way that we've seen extreme nationalisms in Germany and Europe in the 20th century. Couldn't be German and Jewish. German national identity was being defined over against Judaism and Jewishness, really. And so that role that anti-Semitism has played in terms of constructing white and national identity is much longer than the past couple of decades, and we need to pay attention to that. And that's what I see in a lot of the anti-Muslim rhetoric I encounter in Europe and even now in the United States. Serious debates in Britain and Germany over, can you be Muslim and German? Can you be Muslim and French? Can you be Muslim and American? Wasn't that what Jeanine Pirro was getting at in Fox News? Representative Omar actually couldn't be Muslim and American because she wore a hijab, or she was following something called Sharia, right? But it's that trope, that stereotype about if you're in this racial or religious minority category, you can't be one of us. That is one of the connecting points between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that I think we need to pay a lot more attention to than we have. And finally, I'll say on that point, we need to pay careful attention to how many political operatives pit Jews and Muslims against each other for larger, more insidious political purposes and, dare I say, imperialistic projects. And that has been happening very recently in America. I try to say this as often as I can. Islamophobia is not the solution to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is not the solution to Islamophobia. But you'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of political figures and public figures who can actually say that and think that and articulate that very clearly. These two communities are pitted against each other. This is deliberate. It is orchestrated. It is insidious, and we must resist it.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum again. I'll be really brief. So I'll start with a story. So right after 9/11, roughly 2 weeks into 9/11, I was a first-year law student at the UCLA School of Law. I was one of very few, I would say, conspicuous and unapologetic Muslims. I wore a keffiyeh, had a Palestinian flag in my backpack. I was not somebody who wanted to hide my Muslim and Arab identity in the direct aftermath of the 9/11 terror attacks on a campus, UCLA, where Islamophobia was quite strong and Zionism was also quite pervasive on that campus. And I share that story because it segues into what came to be a really transformative experience in my life. I had the chance to take a class called Critical Race Theory from a woman professor named Kimberly Crenshaw, who you might know coined this term intersectionality and wrote brilliant pieces mapping the margins, the marginalizing pieces that came to form the canon of what intersectionality means and how it unfolds. So ironically enough, I came to learn about Islamophobia, Orientalism, anti-Semitism from a black female professor who taught me about those things through the specific lens of fighting anti-black racism. And I say that to say many things, that these intersections that we're talking about right now have to be sort of tethered and tied to this country's history of anti-black racism and the otherization of blackness as being the antithesis of white identity, which is a stand-in and a synonym for citizenship. And one of the first things Professor Crenshaw taught us as a collective in that class was that whiteness was not monolithic. Whiteness was not fixed. Whiteness was perpetually fluid, and whiteness always vacillates. And what I want to address right now is that whiteness is narrowing, right? It's becoming far more narrow in definition, discursively and popularly, the way it's being framed on the ground. One of the first books I read in that class was a book by Karen Brodkin called When Jews Were Not White Folks, right? This idea that Jewish identity in the late 19th century and early 20th century effectively excluded practicing Jews and conspicuous Jews who were coming from the European continent as being bona fide whites. Even though many Jews who did not express their religious identity in vivid, conspicuous terms could pass as white, the more they freely exercised their religious identity, the less white they became. What we saw with anti-Semitism at that era is escalating today, and we see it very vividly with what took place in Squirrel Hill at the Pittsburgh synagogue many months ago. In the visuals of what took place in Pittsburgh, once we juxtapose them with what took place in New Zealand, we're exactly the same, right? The same drivers, the same motivations, the same ideology, the same inspiration of the shooter in Pittsburgh were identical to what motivated the shooter in Christchurch in New Zealand. And why is that? Does it matter that the victims in Pittsburgh were Jewish, and does it matter that the victims in New Zealand were Muslims? For us it does, because we embrace the idea of religious pluralism, and individuals should have the right to freely exercise their faith as they see fit. But for the shooters it didn't. For the shooters it didn't because they viewed Jews in Pittsburgh, and they viewed Muslims in New Zealand as pariahs, as individuals that were definitely not white, and a class of individuals that could not be assimilated into the body politic that is the United States and in New Zealand based on their religious identity. I'm working on a piece now called Faith in Whiteness, which effectively looks to complicate how religion, right, informs how we think about race. But at this very juncture, this growing tide of white supremacy sees religious identity as being focal to racial identity, which excludes Jews, excludes Muslims from this body, not only as being qualified as whites, but as a class of people that can be assimilated at all into broader society. Those are the parallels, and clearly there are distinct tropes, there are distinct stereotypes that are attached to Muslim identity, things like violence, things like savagery, things like, civilizational menace that stem from Orientalism. Great piece by Letty Volpe, a University of California, Berkeley Law School professor, called The Citizen and the Terrorist, which sort of mines these tropes from the Orientalist imagination. And different tropes that are attached to Jewish identity, right? Tropes that are just as damaging but are distinct in nature. But it's key to understand that religious identity is very focal and very driving with regard to who qualifies as white and who cannot qualify as citizens.
So far we've talked about intersections and talked about religious intolerance and the intersections with race. I also want to introduce another term that those of us in critical ethnics and race studies often use. It's relational. So it's not just intersections in terms of the ways in which one's religious identity, gender, and race all work together to either categorize one as, let's talk about immigration, a good immigrant or a bad immigrant. It's also about how specific classifications of people or how certain groups are related in that spectrum of good and bad to another. And I think, we can't talk about the rise of Islamophobia and the rise of, or the persistence of, say persistence in both of these terms, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, without also understanding the persistence of xenophobia and racism. So we've talked a lot about this trope of displacement, a trope of foreignness, and also one thing that we haven't talked about is a trope of foreign conspiracy. Let's not forget that both Catholics and Jews in the American colonies, some colonies barred them outright. They had unequal access to citizenship. They were prone to expulsion. And let's not forget that the anti-Catholic movement in the 19th century was predicated on this idea of a foreign papal conspiracy, that Catholic immigrants were allegedly part of an invasion that was organized by foreign Catholic monarchs and the Pope in Rome to take over the United States. This trope that connects religion as a threat, so non-Protestant religion as a threat, with foreignness and with some sort of foreign invasion or conspiracy, is one that cuts across both anti-Catholicism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. And so I wonder, we talked a little bit about tropes, but can we bring in that global dimension, both historically and in terms of contemporary, if possible?
If I could speak about the intensification of Islamophobia in the United States, actually we could have a specific time where the intensification occurred. It's actually around the Obama campaign. If you remember, Obama was being accused of being a closet Muslim, that he was part of the Brotherhood movement conspiracy. And again, if you think about the conspiracy, that the Brotherhood would have conspired to bring a Kenyan in here to find a white woman, impregnate her, and to have a child that in Hawaii then comes back in here to work in the inner city in Chicago, to get elected into the Senate, to get to dupe all Americans to vote for him to win the presidency. Let's say if they have that conspiracy, I really want to talk to them and to see if they could take our homelessness program and see if they could actually have a conspiracy that would address it. But it functions in here. I think the American society at the time that stoked Islamophobia wanted to use the N-word on Obama. But they felt still the oxygen in the air was prohibitive, so they felt comfortable to using the M-word as a substitute for the N-word. And that's where you get the birth of the birther movement, the Tea Party, and they stoke Islamophobia, and then it succeeded in the midterm 2010 election. The most expensive single deployment of resources in the Islamophobic funding is actually around the election of Obama. They deployed the documentary Obsession, which was funded by the Clarion Fund. And just a few weeks before the election, the 2008 election, it was distributed. 28 million copies of the DVD was distributed in your Sunday newspaper at a cost of $17 million. Now, I know you and me don't have $17 million. We barely can actually afford our coffee, which means that somebody that had a very strategic interest to deploy that amount of resources targeting Obama, using M-word as the N-word. My second theory goes the following, that as a result of the economic collapse, a whole host of economic, political interests wanted to disrupt any possibility of us having a larger discussion about the failure of our economic program, the failure of our political leadership, and therefore goes into that Islamophobia becomes a good distraction. So instead of thinking why you lost your home, or 12 million Americans lost their homes, thousands of stores closed, you begin to think that the reason this is taking place because there is a Muslim under your bed. So Monsters Incorporated becomes the substitute for us to have a serious discussion of why we have the Great Recession that took place and how did we get into that point. And I think those are the things that we need to relate to, the racist structures, the economic structures, and why somebody like Robert Mercer, who actually funds the Islamophobic ads, creates or funds the Cambridge Analytica, funds the Breitbart. Why would somebody of that stature puts their resources in there? My sense is that you have always to follow the dollar and follow the interest that attach to it. but we have been able to be susceptible to these, what I consider to be massive advertisement campaign, that we begin to understand and think that it's Islamophobia. So your car, you bought a VW, rather than thinking that VW cheated the testing on the VW, you think it's the Muslim that's in the engine. And therefore you begin to run to the mosque to think about what is the Imam saying, rather than getting the CEO to stand and actually say, why did you knowingly cheat the test in order to sell cars to people, and then get a slap on the hand, pay a fine, and then do it again? I think what we need is to be very smart in how we understand these dynamics and what is being deployed on a daily basis.
Khaled, did you want to say something about the global aspect of, and this idea of not just displacement of white bodies in the United States, but you know, Muslim immigration as part of a foreign conspiracy? I saw you nodding a lot, and so I didn't know if that was in relation to something.
So I'm glad to answer that question, but the first question, you know, really sat with me. I just had the chance to teach this case in constitutional law called Korematsu versus the United States, which you all might know is the internment case. And when you talk about tropes, and specifically tropes that are mobilizable by halls of power to effectively other specific groups, there's an interesting kind of juxtaposition between Japanese Americans during that era and then Catholic Americans during that era, right? A way in which your phenotype, your physical complexion, enables you to effectively take cover from otherization that individuals without the ability to pass as white cannot take cover. So if we compare what happened to Catholics, and obviously you know, there was this prevailing conspiracy that the Catholic Church was looking to take over the United States, it never reached the depths of vileness that it reached with Japanese Americans during World War II. And that is part and parcel because of phenotype. The fact that the state, in that court case, the Supreme Court case, the way in which Japanese Americans looked distinct from white Americans allowed the state to mobilize the most, you know, inhuman sort of vile, you know, sort of intervention, which is internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese residents during that time, which gives us considerable insight as to what's happening now, both globally but also domestically in the United States. When we can other a people based on physical markers, whether phenotypic or religious expression, the hijab being a classic example, brown and black skin being another example, it enables the state to enact and extend even more egregious, more nefarious forms of policing than it does a class of people that have that cover of at least phenotypic whiteness. And that's what's happening with Muslims across the globe. If you look at what's happening in Europe and places like France, for instance, I just wrote this piece about how 60 to 70% of the prison inmates in France are Muslims. 60 to 70%. France actually bans, it's illegal to have racial statistics, right? But studies have shown that the population of Muslims in France is 6 to 8%. So the fact that the prison population is significantly bigger than the actual population of Muslims on the ground just demonstrates the, you know, kind of the extent and the depth of Islamophobia in France, which I think, if you were asking me to compare it, I think it's worse in France than it is in the United States, right? But even aside from Western countries, it's critical to see how Muslim identity is otherized in non-white societies. And we can talk about China, right? The internment of Uyghur Muslims in China, for instance, where you have reportedly 1.8 Uyghur Muslims being placed in internment camps. That is a country where we don't have white supremacy, but we have Han supremacy, right? And that government is effectively using phenotype in ethnicity and religion as a way to otherize, police, and then incarcerate their community. So tropes, so two things that, you know, kind of emanate from that are really important. It's critical to understand that Islamophobia looks different and is deployed differently in distinct host contexts in different countries. The way Islamophobia functions in a place like India, where Hindu supremacy is intensifying, is dramatically different than it looks here in the United States, where it is tethered and anchored in white supremacy, right? The second point is that tropes are different. Sometimes tropes are imagined, sometimes tropes are tied to religion, but oftentimes they're tied to physical expression and race. And in my opinion, once the algorithm that is most destructive for a group is when they're religiously different, racially different and culturally different, it enables the state to otherize in the most destructive way.
As well as gender.
As well as gender as well, yep.
Yeah. I want to push on the concept of race a little bit more because I think it's so important historically to understand how categories of race have changed over time, right? So one of the things about the anti-Catholic movement is that Irish Catholics were actually thought of as racially and biologically different and inferior to Anglo-Saxon Protestants. One of the huge differences, however, is that they were never denied the power to vote, which gets us back to democracy and how we can fight against the powers of hate and violence. So one of the reasons why, I would argue, one of the most important reasons why Irish eventually became white, even though they were never not white, was because they had the political power to vote xenophobic politicians out of office. The anti-Catholic movement was so strong that it created the first anti-immigrant political party. When we talk about politics and xenophobia, the Know Nothing Party or the American Party, their slogan was America for Americans. They pioneered the politicization of xenophobia, getting voters to the polls to vote for an anti-immigrant politicians and anti-immigrant policies. They had 1 million members in the 1850s. Hugely important. We could not have Trump without the know-nothings. You could not have the Chinese Exclusion Act or Japanese American incarceration. With all of these precedents, both legal, political, cultural, that have allowed xenophobia to become an American tradition. So this idea of race, how is it that in the 19th century we thought of as Irish as somehow not white? Jews, Southern Italians, Eastern Europeans were also considered somehow less than white. Asians for sure were not white, as well as with African Americans and Native Americans. How do we continue to sort of morph those racial categories? How do those change? How is it that Chinese immigrants, who were the first to be banned as singled out as a group, are now the model minority? And what does that mean? And how do we use another trope, the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant, as a source of distraction, as a source of division? So I want to now maybe turn the conversation a little bit more towards what do we do about it. It has been revealed now that you can't study these systems of hate in a vacuum. I remember an article, a headline after Pittsburgh. It was a quote from, I think, one of the members of the synagogue, and it basically said, "We thought anti-Semitism was dead. Now we know better." One of the things I've seen in the past few years is I think, a resurgence of interfaith coalitions, interracial coalitions. There have been many times over the past, several centuries and certainly several decades since the civil rights movements, when social justice struggles have brought people together, people who had not worked together before. So this is not necessarily something new, but it does seem much more magnified and hopefully lays a foundation for a broader and enduring coalition than what we have seen before. And so I wanted to turn the conversation to what you all have seen on the ground and whether you see the same developments as somehow cautiously optimistic, or what should we be keeping in mind as we think about turning our attention to challenging these systems of oppression? Yeah,
I can speak to that a little bit. I'll start off. So community organizing basically says that the way to solve these things is about relationships. It's about how we make connections across seeming differences and how we use those connections to create positive social change that benefits the most directly impacted communities, but also everyone, because we all see ourselves as very interconnected. So it's really not just about having like this vague understanding, but really understanding how these things operate on a systemic level and how they are ongoing, like you said, since the Inquisition, and understanding our histories and understanding how there is a very intentional tide to divide us. And it's actually, if you want to think about like, I want to be the most left person, I want to be the most progressive, the most radical person, one of the most radical things you can do is come together and learn about other people, and not just in superficial ways, but in real ways where you have real relationships with people and you're working on common things together. I would also throw in that having a sense of hope, which can feel really impossible and it can sound kind of like fluffy, and how do we even grab onto that given this magnitude of all these things going on, just knowing that we have this cycles of history and that we have these demonstrable moments in history where people have made things better. And so using that to kind of keep going is a big, important thing. So on the ground, I would say people are seeing bigger stakes. I would just say in Minneapolis around the organizing that we're doing, for example, around immigration and the criminal justice system in those intersections. I feel like there's a lot of stuff that people have been working on for decades now that is finally coming together because people see how much higher the stakes are. They're seeing, you know, we've studied about this intersectionality, we've learned about it, we've heard about it, we have conversations about it, but people are actually seeing how it's playing out in our actual individual and communal lives. And so that's putting a lot of fire under people to change things for the better.
Lauren, can you give, just because so much of our audience is local, can you give a specific example, project, group that we might want to know more about?
Sure. So there's a campaign that Jewish Community Action is involved in with over 30 plus community organizations from labor, from different faith groups, from immigrant groups, from criminal justice groups who have come together to work on issues around ICE and how ICE is in cooperation and conjunction with Hennepin County. And so we're working on a campaign to separate out so that the sheriff no longer cooperates with ICE and no longer says, hey, have an office in our jail, so as soon as people come in for a traffic violation, you can take them and take them off whatever you do with people. And so we have people who are making a lot of progress around that. There are some politicians and some electeds who are listening around that. Similarly, the group is also has been working for a long time on getting driver's licenses for all. So this is a way for undocumented communities to have access to identification that makes life a lot more fluid for people who don't have to worry about that. You may take for granted all these different examples of when you need an ID. When you don't have it, life is not easy. So that is a couple of examples.
If I could complicate the issue a little bit. I think we have to be very careful of not jumping from where the crisis is to having interfaith or interfaith dialogue, assuming that the heavy lifting of dealing with the crisis itself is not being done. So I'm a person that actually work on interfaith work for justice. If you want to have a dialogue about your idea of God and my idea of God, take a theology class. Seriously, it's just for me to actually take 3 hours of my day for us to read 2 or 3 texts of religious significance, and all are significant. For me, that's a class in theology or interreligious dialogue. But if you're actually trying to change the society for social justice, there has to be interfaith work for justice, and we need to deal with the contradictions that exist in our own communities. I know for myself, as an Arab, Palestinian, Muslim, there's contradictions in my community around racial issues. So while on the one hand they want to deal with racism, there is anti-black racism in the community. There are some economic pernicious activities that take place in some parts of the immigrant community. For example, I work around in Oakland, where in every corner there's a liquor store, and unfortunately some of those liquor stores are owned by Arab and Muslim immigrants. For me, that's a contradiction. You can't actually fight Islamophobia without actually dealing with the contradiction that exists in there, and therefore there has to be some heavy lifting to deal with it. I cannot speak about Muslim prisoners without recognizing that we have a prison industrial complex where if you're black, your track to jail is much faster than to Yale across this country, and that contradiction has to be resolved and addressed, because we can't all of a sudden, because we're dealing with Islamophobia, that we begin like superhuman rights activists but not dealing with our contradictions. Now I want to complicate it a little bit further. You could see that I'm dealing. We cannot deal with Islamophobia and anti-Semitism without confronting the question of Palestine and Israel. We cannot deal with Islamophobia without asking the question, why is it a segment of the pro-Israel Jewish community and the major Jewish organizations, and I think erroneously so, are putting their bet on aligning with the right wing in the United States and thinking that stoking Islamophobia and white supremacy is the way to protect Israel. My sense, again, if you read history, the relationship of white supremacy to Jews and Muslims, they're equal opportunity. They hate both. The fact that they forward hatred toward Muslims today because of opportunistic consideration, or they think that possibly Islamophobia can bring Jesus quicker, that contradiction had to be understood, and we need to challenge our own communities as we confront Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. Behind every Islamophobe is an anti-Semite, even though today he would put that he supports Israel. He supports Israel for all the wrong consideration, even though that they might be foreign. That contradictions have to be resolved and have to be addressed. Otherwise, we're again saying, let's hold hand and sing We're the World, while the world is not including us in the conceptualization of the world. So those are the contradictions that have to be addressed in a systematic way.
It's a great question. I mean, it's the practical, how do we respond to all this? Because otherwise, just spending a day talking about Islamophobia will be overwhelming. We get cynical very quickly, and then we go home very depressed. I'll start by saying I spent a year at the State Department trying to advise on Islamophobia, and I have engaged other government audiences, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI. It's really frustrating work. I tell you what I learned. I learned that the change will not come from above, though the policies do need to change. I'm not saying let's disengage from politics, but that change will come from below. It'll be from grassroots movements. I think the most significant changes in American history, social changes, have come from below, have come from a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, that hit people where it hurts and who benefited from Jim Crow in terms of the economic side of this, right? And then spread and got more organized. Of course, there has been since the 1960s a very successful counter civil rights movement that has existed, that has led to what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow. And so, you know, it's not a linear process, to be sure. But I think the most significant change comes from below. I definitely agree, relationship building is key. I mean, we do have studies on this. If you know someone of a different religion than your own, you're much less likely to be prejudiced towards that community. If I know someone have a personal relationship with someone who's Jewish, I'm less likely to be anti-Semitic. There are caveats to those studies and those theories, and a lot of that has to do with whether me being less anti-Semitic translates into significant political action. How do you affect political change when individuals are changing their opinions about religious communities, but the policies are not changing? So it does have to get plugged into and channeled into political movements. But as someone who's traveled around the United States and abroad even on this topic, the most successful instances I've seen of pushing back against Islamophobia, and very effectively in a political sense, have come from coalitions that include Muslims as significant partners that have been around not for a few years, but usually for decades. And have really established deep roots in the community and have been doing this work long term. Few audiences want me to talk about, well, the real solution is long term, right? We are trying to do triage all the time, as we have been after New Zealand. But if you do not have a long-term strategy, we are in trouble, right? If we do not have a long-term strategy, we're in trouble. And that involves relationship building, coalition building, and translating that into effective political action. And with Muslims, it's even more important. I'm reminded about the reference to anti-Catholic history, right? And what's different? And there are some differences. How Catholics were racialized is certainly different, was different. but also the number of Catholics. By the 1930s, there actually were an awful lot of Catholics in the United States. Those who are fearing that there were going to be large numbers of Catholics, I mean, why they were afraid, we can quibble with, right? But there were actually large numbers, and Catholics could eventually build effective political movements, build institutions, social institutions, educational institutions, hospitals that really ingrain them into a lot of different communities, including the Twin Cities, right? You have a lot of Catholic institutions in this region. Muslims, on the other hand, make up about between 1% and 2% of the population, depends on what poll you look at, but are a much smaller community and don't have those same kinds of institutions over time that Catholics have been able to build. That might change, to be sure, but the numbers are certainly not there, and so therefore the coalition building is all the more significant, which is why I harp on so much about allies and my frustration with many of us who are allies who are not doing the coalition building ourselves. I still think that it's all of our responsibilities to combat Islamophobia and all forms of bigotry and racism, but I think the primary moral responsibility falls on people like me. Muslims, when they fight Islamophobia, are trying to survive. Jews trying to fight anti-Semitism are trying to survive. It falls on people with my background to actually start to do more of this lifting. I don't think we're doing our part of the lifting at all, and I don't think we're taking seriously the fact that the primary moral burden falls on us as Islamophobia primarily is emanating from us. And so that's what needs to change. And in instances where I've seen that happen in local communities across the country here and there, I've seen some great work in translating that into a national movement will be significant if we're going to change these policies. And elections do matter, even though that doesn't mean voting for the Democratic Party means you get rid of Islamophobia. I promise you there's plenty of Islamophobia in the Democratic Party, but elections do matter. This region of all regions knows that, right, because of the history you've made here. And if that history can be repeated in other places, I think we might start to see significant change in this country.
I'd just like to add a few more comments, and that is, it is also dependent on communities like mine, communities who have experienced past injustices and know what it's like to be excluded and banned and separated from families, to be able to see ourselves in communities that are suffering the same as well. And so I do want to call your attention to the back of your program. You'll see the list of sponsors. One of the leading civil rights organizations nationally is the Japanese American Citizens League. They're the one with the crest with I guess it's an eagle, and especially the ways in which they've partnered with CAIR Minnesota in recent years to call out Islamophobia and all forms of injustice and bigotry in a really massive educational campaign. I do have to say, however, I just finished writing a history of xenophobia in the United States from the colonial era to the present, and I do not end on a hopeful note, I have to say. By the end of writing that book, I kind of just wanted to crawl into a dark space and cry. So I do see some hopeful change, but it goes far beyond 2020. It goes far beyond the United States. We're going to have a fantastic session later this afternoon on global Islamophobia. This is not a problem that is going away, with record numbers of people being forced from their homes, 60 million recorded by the UN last year, and more countries moving to the far right to nationalist and isolationist policies. This is just the tip of the iceberg, I hate to say it. And so the kinds of work that you all are doing in your various institutions and with the projects that help educate the rest of us, as well as the work on the ground, is the first step. So thank you so much. I promised more time for questions. We have a little less than 20 minutes. And I'm sure there are people who want to share experiences and offer insights, so I'm going to open up the floor. And I don't know how this works. So do I run around with the microphone? Okay. Do you have a microphone? Okay, great. So raise your hand, please, if you have a question that you'd like to ask the panel.
Hi, I just had a quick question. So I wanted to find out what are some ways that Muslims, I'm a Muslim myself, and I would want to know what are some ways that we perpetuate Islamophobic ideas either consciously or subconsciously, intentionally and unintentionally? What are some examples that our own leaders within our communities have done so, and how do we identify that and work on it?
Well, let's say the following. There are bad Muslims, good Muslims, in-between Muslims, and then there is me. I'm of the opinion that no matter what a Muslim does, it should not be a rationalization for blaming the group. Right? That's at the basis of racism. And for Muslims, again, is to think that we have to go through a 12-step program therapy to try to make ourselves perfect so the racists would not hit us in the face. So I think what we need is to get rid of this aspect that Muslims' actions results in the Islamophobia and racism toward Muslims. The mere fact is the following. White supremacy, which in the past few years has been the primary perpetrator of violence, we don't actually have discrimination structurally toward white people, which would be legitimately, if that paradigm is held, would be the response to it. But it's actually the contrary, because we are living in a global white supremacy epistemic, and therefore even when violence is committed from white supremacists, we don't attribute or attach to it the same type of consequences. Part of also what I recommend is de-aggregating violence and CVE from Islamophobia. This is a discussion we had at the Carter Center, where the whole discussion began that in order to address Islamophobia, we have to address CVE and embrace counter-violent extremism. And for me, that what you call wedding of these two is an error in approach, because again, just using the concept of black-on-black violence, you don't address racism against blacks by putting blacks and asking them, you need to resolve black-on-black violence. Why? Because there's most white is on white violence, but we don't approach the problem from that vantage point. So we have to, again, insist on a methodology that is sound, that is actually universal and can be the test of time. Lastly, I would say the following. And this is a piece I wrote. Humanizing the human is a dehumanizing act. I don't want anybody to humanize me. I'm already human to begin with. So engaging in a discourse to try to humanize the human begins with a point of dehumanizing, because you're asking them to actually come into a point where they have to assert that they're a human. And that discourse, again, is a very, very problematic, because it assumes as a point of departure that is a subhuman category in there. This doesn't mean that you don't have to relate to people as people, and with the contradiction you do, but the methodology of saying that we're going to engage in that approach, for me, it leads to a much more complex problem in the long run.
Any other questions?
Hello? Hi, I'm from Southern Africa. Most African families are huge, big. On my father's side alone, I think I have 103 first cousins. I would rather fight with all of them. Now, the reason I'm saying that is this. You said something about marrying two ideas together. Now, these two ideas are pretty horrible, but if you married them together, what's the worst that could happen to either Muslim leaders or the Muslim community? I'm not Muslim. So, Muslim terrorist is, that phrase seems to roll off the tongue for a lot of people. A Muslim terrorist. Now, white supremacist seems to be rolling off a lot of people's tongues. I'm pretty average, I don't know a lot of things, but I hear what you guys are saying. What's the worst that could happen if Muslim leaders, you said they shouldn't do that. What's the worst that could happen if Muslim leaders condemned Muslim terrorists and in the same sentence married Muslim terrorists with white supremacy terrorists? And I'm talking about in speeches that are given. A lot of people talk about Muslim terrorists this, Muslim terrorists that. What happens if you combine Muslim terrorists like white supremacy terrorists do X, Y, Z? What is the worst thing that could happen to the Muslim community or Muslim leaders if they married those two horrible ideas together. Because one group, I feel like it would be hard for white Americans who are forgive my words. I feel like it would be hard for white Americans who are not what's wrong with marrying the two ideas? Muslim terrorist, white supremacist terrorist, condemn both of them and have Muslim leaders say it a whole lot. I'm not quite sure what, especially people who wouldn't like Muslims, how would they fight against that? Because Muslim terrorism is messed up. White supremacist terrorism is messed up. So there's no way to defend one and not. That make sense?
Well, let me try to understand and maybe respond to this. If you think about terrorism as a concept, it has no religious identity, nor a racial identity. It crosses the border, meaning every group has individuals that commit terrorist act. But it seems that we exceptionalize the Muslim category. So when a Muslim commits a terrorist act, the attribute that is most focused on is the Muslimness, not the terrorist part. When a white person, again, commits an act, the act becomes the focus, and then we try to find what is the stimuli. So, and often the stimuli, we look whether he has a psychological problems and so on. We don't ask the priest of his church to come and discuss, condemn, and engage. We actually, for the Muslim subject, we begin to go 7 generations back where he attended or passed by a mosque, even though that they most likely would not have been in a mosque, nor recognize the mosque if they actually crossed it. The data shows that the more religious you are, the more civically engaged. I did a whole Bay Area Muslim study with 1,100 survey and so on. Actually, the more that you actually are attached to the mosque in terms of your observance, the more you're civically engaged, the more you volunteer, and the more you donate. But you don't see this framing, because the only framing that wants to be operable is, again, the Muslim terrorist. Why? Because there's a whole structure that actually responds to this. So we need to speak today of the countering violent extremism industrial complex. We need to speak of the war on terror as a financial enterprise, economic enterprise that lasts at least since the Iraq war. Close to $6 trillion have been used in relations to the war on terror, right? Where the United States have deployment in 39 different countries post 9/11. Those dynamics begin to be silenced once you get the Muslim attribute in there, because it actually begins to shut our analytical way of how we need to understand. What I said we don't need to marry is the following. Is countering violent extremism being wedded to addressing and solving Islamophobia. Methodologically and structurally are two different. In this, we need to understand what are the stimuli, what are the causalities that bring somebody to commit a terrorist act, whether they're Muslim or otherwise. What is the ideological basis? What are possible ingredients that make it possible? In here, what are the racializations that took place from the dominant society where Muslims are, that begin to otherize them and exclude them from the society? Right? So those, structurally, theoretically, these are two different phenomena. Those individuals that insist on marrying them, basically trying to give legitimacy to the whole otherization and securitization of the Muslim subject in the Islamophobia and the other, telling you that we're not going to address Islamophobia unless we address counter-violence extremism, and the only way to counter violence extremism is by Muslims accepting to securitize themselves. Right? That is the logical outcome in this sense that we need to argue and insist of separating methodologies to addressing each and not to actually make one contingent on the other. It doesn't mean that they don't have what you call elements that gets to be mobilized. That's a different issue of mobilizing certain elements versus the structure of what's there.
just want to say really briefly, I think the greatest privilege attached to whiteness is individuality, right? So when the terrorist in New Zealand commits that terror attack, they're not going to New Zealand, I mean, they're not going to Australia and asking other white men to condemn and apologize for those acts. When Dylan Roof walks into that church in Charleston, South Carolina, they're not surveying white young men in that area and asking them how they feel about terrorism. However, when we go to the other side and talk about black and brown and Asian identity, there's the responsibility of collective and collateral guilt, that the entire group is responsible for the acts of one individual and one bad actor. So that is very much a cornerstone of white supremacy, that privilege and that presumption of individuality is always attached to bad actors on the white side. And we can see the framing in the media, the way in which we call terrorists, lone wolves. They're sick, they're psychological, they're always deviant, aberrational actors. On the Muslim side, however, there's something wrong with the collective, there's something wrong with the entire body, that these individuals are treated as emanations of an entire monolithic block. With whites, it's always individuals who are individualized.
I'll just quickly say, because I've written an entire book about why we should not ask Muslims to condemn terrorism. It's a racist question, particularly in the current context. Yeah, we should all condemn terrorism, but first we should ask what gets labeled as terrorism. Terrorism has become, it shouldn't be, but it's become a racialized term. It doesn't generally refer to people like me. The media has been trying so hard with this New Zealand guy to use the T word, but it's in fits and starts. It's a struggle. It does not roll naturally off the tongue for a lot of journalists these days to look at a guy like that and call him a terrorist. Had he been Muslim, we know that wouldn't have been so hard. So the word terrorism doesn't really have any objective meaning. It is a racialized term, and it applies to particular communities and not others, not people like me. But more importantly, therefore, in that context, when Muslims get singled out to ask, why aren't Muslims condemning terrorism? Where is that moderate Muslim, right? Why don't they do more to it? And this is a question that's been asked since 9/11 in very intense sorts of ways, and by major journalists like Tom Friedman, by most prominent political operatives across the political spectrum, Democrats and Republicans in the United States. It's a ubiquitous question. It's a racist question. It is a racist question. And I'm going to tell you this because I can tell you who confirmed this for me: Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, and his Senate confirmation, when he was called out after the Boston Marathon bombings, complaining that Muslim leaders aren't doing enough to speak out against terrorism, which was a lie. It wasn't misinformation, it was a lie. And then when he was called upon that, to address that in the Senate confirmation hearing, he tried to qualify it a little bit, but then the follow-up question was, well, what would it take for Muslims to do enough to condemn terrorism in a way that's satisfying to people like me? And he was honest and said, I'm not sure there is enough. I don't think Muslims can condemn terrorism until they're blue in the face. It doesn't matter anymore, right? You're still going to be subject to collective guilt. There is no answer you can give. There's no dance you can do that's going to persuade many prominent politicians and journalists asking that question. That Muslims aren't somehow complicit in or harboring some latent violent terrorist sympathies. You're going to continue to be objects of suspicion. So we need to start calling out, and people like me particularly need to start calling out the racism behind the question to begin with, including when respectable journalists at CNN or the New York Times like Tom Friedman ask such ridiculous questions where the answer to whether Muslims are condemning terrorism is a 5-second Google search away. You do not have to be an expert in Google search engines to know how to find the answer to that. But the very question itself, even with the answer, is prejudice, and it's not something that gets asked of me. I have yet to be asked to condemn Christchurch. People just assume I do. No one ever asked me to condemn what happened in Charleston. People just assume I find that abhorrent. That same consideration is not given to Muslims. And you know what the word for that is? Racism.
Hi, thank you. I'll make this quick. First off, thank you for coming today. I've enjoyed listening to each of your perspectives. My name is John Loretz, and I am the Executive Sergeant of the Major Crimes Division for the St. Paul Police Department. One of my duties is collecting bias and hate crime statistics, and also being the final arbiter for St. Paul before we submit our numbers to, eventually to the FBI. We had 15 hate crimes last year, in 2018, 15 too many. But it was a 25% decrease from the year before. I don't know what that means. Does that mean that hate crimes are down? Anecdotally, what you hear around the country, no. But obviously, I don't know if it's a matter of it not being reported, if people are worried about working with the police department. What I would just like to reaffirm is just our commitment to all the communities in St. Paul. And I wonder if you could enlighten us on what you can do in your roles as leaders to assist the police department to call out these things, to investigate these types of incidents. And I'll sit down and listen.
Now, the data sets on hate crimes is still very problematic because not every hate crime is reported. I've been sensitive. I'm used to that. So. The statistics and data on hate crimes is still, as a set, is not there because what gets reported is only a small number of what takes place on a daily basis. We know this not only in relations to hate crime, but again, I worked on campus on the whole issue of rape, sexual harassment, and we knew that only a very small number of cases gets reported, and only smaller than those get actually escalated to an actual investigation. So there's a challenge in there of educating our community. So just this past year, I actually developed an app. It's the Islamophobia reporting app. And we're trying to get it to the community members so they would report. It has different types of incidents that could be reported. And not every incident gets to be actionable because some incidents are not, like for example, somebody saying go back home. It's not actionable, but it is a form of harassment that your body and space does not feel safe. So we need to document those. For those cases that require follow-up, we send those that require follow-up to the police as well as CAIR, the Asian Law Caucus, and other civil rights organizations, in order for us to have a data set that could actually give a picture of what is taking place. So we're hoping actually on a monthly basis to send out to policymakers as well as the community those cases that are occurring that are being reported, and we're trying to distribute this in the community. The second level development of the app, we're trying to actually aggregate a Twitter feed into it in order to see where the Twitter feed in relations to Islamophobic rhetoric on social media, especially Twitter, do we have in there a hot zone where maybe there is a hate group that is operating, or a civil society actor, a politician that is using Islamophobic discourse and thus increasing the level of hate crimes and hate incidents in the community. So that's the next level of the development, because I think data is very important, because if you don't have data, you can't impact the people who are on the front line, and also you can't impact policy. So data is very critical, and this is both for the community and others. Interesting, I do work in France. I have a regular conference in there. It's like 6th year. You can't collect data on racial disparities in there. And if there is no data, then there is no problem. So again, this is part of the structural, which is a pernicious structure relative to what is experienced in France relative to Islamophobia. It's just you don't have the data that actually specifically can look at the problem with a complete set to understand what is taking place. So the positive in here that we do have a data set. It might be incomplete, and we need to complete it.
The card that says time, and I think y'all might be hungry for lunch. So if you can help me in thanking our panelists for a great conversation.
The complete